They say even the most untouchable stars have their breaking point, and in a packed courtroom that smelled faintly of tension and expensive perfume, Blake Lively just hit hers, because this time the whispers weren't coming from tabloids or anonymous sources. This time they were coming from the bench, from the judge himself, and when he leaned forward and told her in no uncertain terms that her actions amounted to doxing her opponents, the air in the room changed. No one laughed, no one moved. Because this wasn't the glamorous Hollywood darling who could turn any scandal into a photo op. This was a defendant being told by the highest authority in the room that enough was enough, and you could see it in her eyes. She knew this wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This was the kind of reprimand that follows you, that gets quoted in court records, that changes how the world sees you. And what happened next will have you questioning whether Blake Lively just crossed the one line. Even her most powerful connections can't protect her. From the courtroom was already tense before Blake Lively arrived, but the second she stepped through the heavy double doors, the atmosphere thickened. Her arrival was choreographed the way only a Hollywood A-lister can manage. The hair, the dress, the perfectly rehearsed expressions, but today no amount of polish could hide the fact that this hearing was different. This wasn't a routine scheduling matter or a back and forth over procedural motions. This is about the judge himself taking the rare and almost unheard of step of reprimanding her in open court, and it all centered on allegations that she had crossed a dangerous legal and ethical boundary by revealing the personal information of those who dared to challenge her in this high-stakes defamation battle. According to the filings, which had already been making waves online, Blake had allegedly shared identifying details of her legal opponents under the guise of transparency. But the other side argued it was a calculated move designed to intimidate to silence, and to send a message to every other potential critic that going up against her would have consequences. And as the judge began to speak, you could feel the energy shift. He wasn't reading from a script, he was speaking directly to her, and every sentence was deliberate. Ms. Lively, the court does not tolerate attempts to compromise the safety of any party or witness in these proceedings, he said, and while his tone was measured, the weight behind his words was unmistakable. Blake's team shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Her lead attorney glanced at her as if silently urging her not to react, but her jaw tightened just enough to betray that the words were hitting their mark. The reprimand wasn't just about optics, it had teeth, because the judge made it clear that if there was another incident, if there was even a hint that sensitive information had been shared outside of official channels, the court would consider imposing sanctions up to and including restrictions on her ability to communicate publicly about the case. And for someone like Blake Lively, whose entire career rests on public image, that was no small threat. Still, as the hearing continued, she seemed determined not to give her opponents the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. She leaned back in her chair, hands clasped, a faint smirk crossing her lips, but those who know courtroom strategy recognized it wasn't confidence. It was containment, because no matter how she played it for the cameras, the fact remained. A judge had publicly called her out, and in legal circles, that's the kind of moment that sticks. It becomes part of the narrative, the soundbite, the headline. And sure enough, within minutes of the hearing ending, social media was flooded with clips and quotes, commentators calling it a turning point, a sign that even Blake Lively couldn't spin her way out of this one. But what makes this moment even more dangerous for her is what's happening behind the scenes, because according to multiple insiders, this reprimand might be just the beginning. There are whispers of further motions being prepared to dig deeper into her communications, and if those surface and reveal a pattern of similar behavior, then today's scolding will look like a gentle warning compared to what could come next. And here's the part that no one in her camp wants to admit: the judge's words have emboldened her opponents. Suddenly, witnesses who were hesitant to speak are feeling safer. Suddenly, people are willing to testify to things they previously kept to themselves, and in a case that already had more twists than anyone could follow, this single reprimand could trigger an avalanche of damaging testimony. The question now is how Blake will respond, because if her past is any indication, she won't back down quietly. She'll double down, find a way to reframe herself as the victim, and turn the spotlight back in her favor. But this time the cameras won't be the only audience. The judge is watching closely, her opponents are watching closely, and with the next hearing already set for later this month, we might just be about to witness whether Blake Lively's unmatched ability to control the narrative can survive the one force in Hollywood that doesn't care about celebrity status, the law itself, and if she slips again, even once, the consequences will be swift, public, and career-altering. And just when you thought the hearing could not get any more chaotic, the energy inside that courtroom shifted like a sudden drop in pressure before a storm. Blake's legal team tried to regain control, spinning the narrative that the so-called Doxxing incident was an unintentional consequence of a larger legal filing that her team argued had been public record anyway. But this time the judge wasn't buying it. In fact, what made this moment so riveting to watch was that the judge's tone sharpened every time Blake's counsel attempted to deflect the conversation away from the harm caused to the individuals whose personal details had been revealed. The courtroom gallery leaned forward, some gasping quietly as the judge cited specific rules and precedents, reminding everyone present that even the most famous celebrity is not above the obligation to protect sensitive information in active litigation. And then came the statement that left even Blake's own attorneys visibly rattled. The judge said, "I don't care how high profile this case is or who's involved. The court is not a platform for intimidation, and I will not tolerate the reckless exposure of private citizens to public harassment." At that moment, Blake shifted in her seat, her trademark calm demeanor cracking ever so slightly. She glanced briefly toward her lawyers as if silently asking how this could have turned so sharply against her. And this wasn't just about optics. The repercussions of such a reprimand go far beyond a single court appearance. It plants a seed in the judge's mind that her behavior might not only be careless but calculated, a pattern the opposing counsel wasted no time capitalizing on. They argued that the doxing was not a random oversight, but part of a larger strategy to create a chilling effect on anyone willing to challenge her, a tactic that, if proven true, could dismantle the public image she's worked so hard to build for years. Outside the courthouse, whispers began to circulate faster than the reporters could type about whether the judge might impose sanctions or even refer the matter for further investigation. Legal analysts on live broadcasts began speculating about possible consequences, from monetary fines to stricter court-ordered information controls that could hamstring her legal team's ability to maneuver the way they have in past hearings. But perhaps the most chilling twist in this chapter came from sources close to the opposition. They claim that several of the individuals who are doxxed have already received threatening messages, some describing them in disturbing detail, leading the judge to consider whether a protective order should be expanded. Blake's camp, of course, denied any connection between the leak and these threats, but the damage was done. The narrative had shifted, and now the headlines were no longer about her fight for vindication. They were about her crossing a dangerous line that could backfire spectacularly in the weeks ahead. And if history has shown us anything in high-stakes celebrity litigation, it's that once a judge publicly questions your integrity, the climb back is steep and every step is under a microscope. The question now hanging in the air isn't just whether Blake Lively will win or lose this case, but whether the court itself will decide that her tactics have gone too far for the legal process to tolerate. And as the tension in that packed courtroom reached its breaking point, the atmosphere shifted from tense to downright electric, because what came next was something no one in that room could have predicted for years. Blake Lively had maneuvered through the press, the public, and even the court system with the grace and confidence of someone untouchable. Her carefully crafted public image was as spotless as the pastel gowns she wore to red carpet events, but in that moment the judge's words sliced right through that carefully woven fabric of perfection. It wasn't just a mild correction or a passing remark. This was a full-blown reprimand, and the sting of it seemed to linger in the air. Blake sat frozen, her jaw tightening ever so slightly, as if she knew the cameras might catch even the smallest twitch of emotion. The judge's tone was sharp, controlled, but unyielding. "You cannot use your influence, your fame, or your platform to intimidate witnesses or disclose personal information that could endanger them." The judge's voice was calm, yet each word carried the weight of years of legal authority, and in the silence that followed, the weight of the accusation truly sank. And this wasn't about petty celebrity spats anymore. This was about doxing, a word that carried with it the imagery of online mobs, strangers showing up at doorsteps, and private lives torn apart in public view. And then the court revealed exactly how Blake's actions were tied to the exposure of certain individuals' addresses, phone numbers, and even workplace locations. The collective gasp from those present was deafening. What made it worse was that this wasn't a faceless random victim. These were her legal opponents, people she was in the middle of an intense legal battle with. And the documents showed that the leaked information had been accessed from privileged case files. The implication was chilling, because if someone with her reach and influence was willing to play this dangerously, what did it say about the lengths she might go to win? As murmurs spread through the courtroom, the prosecution's attorney seized the moment, painting a vivid picture of intimidation tactics disguised as accidental leaks, describing how those targeted had suddenly faced an influx of threats messages, and even unmarked packages on their doorsteps, and as those details were read aloud, you could almost see the shift in the room. The once neutral spectators began leaning ever so slightly away from Blake, as if proximity itself might drag them into the blast radius. Her own lawyer tried to interject, arguing that these leaks could have been coincidental, the unfortunate byproduct of an overzealous fanbase or tabloid digging, but the judge wasn't buying it. Not today, not after weeks of what they described as a pattern of behavior that blurred the line between aggressive legal strategy and outright harassment. And here's where it got even more fascinating, because Blake's team had been banking on this hearing being just another procedural step, something they could spin in the press afterward. But the judge's reprimand shifted the narrative entirely. Instead of walking out as the unbothered star with an unshakable legal position, she was now facing whispers of deliberate misconduct and a potential contempt motion, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone that this was happening to someone who had so carefully positioned herself as an advocate for privacy rights. Remember the interviews where she decried the invasive paparazzi and spoke passionately about protecting her children from the public eye. Now that very same person was being accused of crossing that sacred line against her opponents. And here's the thing that will keep you watching, because the deeper we dive into these court transcripts, the more you'll see that this was not an isolated incident. The leaks had patterns, fingerprints, if you will, small but telling signs that pointed back to someone within Blake's inner circle, and possibly to Blake herself, in a way that was harder to dismiss. And the judge's scolding wasn't just about past actions. It came with a thinly veiled warning that if this continued, the repercussions would escalate into something far more damaging than bad headlines. Think sanctions, think limits on what evidence she could access moving forward, think an erosion of credibility that no PR team could fully repair. And in Hollywood, where perception is currency, that's a financial hit as much as it is a reputational one. Now imagine being one of the plaintiffs in this case, knowing that going up against someone like Blake Lively meant not only fighting a legal battle but also risking your safety and peace of mind. That's exactly the fear the court was trying to address when the judge said the words, "Retaliation in the wrong hands is a weapon more powerful than money or influence," and in this case, the court will not allow it to happen again. And while Blake kept her face composed, those who knew her well claimed to see the faintest flicker of something else in her eyes. Not fear exactly, but frustration, maybe even indignation, as if she believed the rules were being twisted against her. But the fact that the reprimand made headlines before she even left the courthouse proved that no matter how much control she thought she had over the narrative, things were slipping. And as we move into what happens next, the real question isn't just whether she can win this case, but whether she can survive the public fallout of a moment where the judge essentially called her out for weaponizing information that was never meant to leave the courtroom walls. Because once that trust is broken, both inside and outside legal circles, it's nearly impossible to get back. And that's why the next move from her legal team will either make or break the entire fight ahead. And yes, we've got receipts and inside accounts of exactly how they plan to spin this, which we'll get into, because the stakes are about to rise even higher than they already are. And as the atmosphere inside that packed courtroom grew heavier than the humid air outside, Blake Lively sat there, visibly tense, shoulders squared but eyes darting toward her legal team as if silently begging for reassurance, yet none came, because this was the part no one could spin away. The judge's voice dropped low and deliberate, a tone meant to cut through all pretense, and he began recounting how private information tied to opposing witnesses had mysteriously found its way into the public domain. Names, addresses, unredacted documents circulating in the same online spaces where heated debates over the case raged, and the implication was impossible to ignore. This wasn't an accidental leak, this was targeted, and the judge made it crystal clear that such actions were intolerable in his courtroom. You could see the journalists in the gallery furiously typing every word, some leaning forward with wide eyes, because the subtext here was that someone connected to Blake's side had crossed a very dangerous line. And in the weeks leading up to this moment, there had been whispers about aggressive tactics, but no one dared say it outright until now. The judge's reprimand wasn't just a warning, it was a public record. And Blake's carefully curated public image, the smiling A-list actress adored by fashion houses and talk shows alike, took a visible hit right there in real time. And the moment he referenced evidence logs showing digital timestamps and metadata suggesting a leak was deliberate, you could practically feel the air leave the room. Her lawyer tried to object, mumbling something about the speculative nature of the claims, but the judge cut him off, reminding everyone that while the court had yet to determine the full origin, the appearance of impropriety was undeniable and unacceptable, then he did something few expected. He ordered an immediate review of all communications from Blake's legal team over the last 30 days, putting them on notice that anything even remotely related to witness safety was under the microscope. The spectators were stunned because this wasn't just about decorum, this was about potentially compromising the safety of people involved in the case. And in Hollywood's hyper-connected circles, this kind of allegation can end careers faster than any box office flop, and the press would feast on it for days, maybe weeks. You could see camera flashes exploding outside through the glass doors as the court recessed for a short break. Blake stood slowly, her face tight, her jaw locked, and she refused to meet the eyes of anyone in the gallery, while her PR handler whispered furiously in her ear. The energy in the hallway was electric, reporters shouting questions about the doxing scandal, her team refusing comment, but that refusal only fueled speculation, and as her SUV pulled away in a blur of tinted windows, the court of public opinion was already holding its own trial, one far more vicious and uncontrollable than anything happening under the judge's gavel. And now, as the courtroom air settled into a tense stillness, the reality of what had just happened hung heavy over everyone. Blake Lively stood there, no longer shielded by the flawless celebrity aura she had so carefully crafted for years, because in that moment the judge's words were not just procedural. They were a public rebuke, a televised humiliation that could not be edited out or spun away by PR teams. This was the moment her power cracked, and everyone saw it. The legal team that once spoke with unshakable confidence now avoided eye contact. The opposing counsel's quiet nods and exchanged glances carried the weight of a silent victory, and the spectators in the gallery leaned forward, sensing they were witnessing the irreversible turning point of a case that had already gripped Hollywood and the internet. The reprimand for doxing opponents wasn't just a line in a court transcript. It was an official statement that the court had caught on to her tactics and was willing to call them out in front of the world. And while Blake tried to maintain that same icy composure, her grip on the edge of the defendant's table told another story. Every second felt longer, every rustle of paper sharper, every shifting seat in the gallery louder, because she knew this wasn't just about a single reprimand, it was about what it represented: an open wound in her legal strategy, an admission from the court that she was not untouchable anymore. And as the judge warned both sides about future conduct, the undercurrent was clear. If Blake pushed any further down this path, the consequences would be far worse. And that's when you could almost hear it in the room, the quiet buzz of people wondering aloud if this was the beginning of the end for her reign of intimidation. Was this the moment where the public perception would tilt for good, where even her most loyal defenders would start to question if they had been backing the wrong side? Because the stakes weren't just about legal outcomes anymore. They were about reputations, alliances, and the unspoken truth that once a celebrity's image fractures, it really repairs. And so the court adjourned, with Blake walking out not as the commanding figure who once seemed to own the narrative, but as someone visibly carrying the weight of a loss she couldn't admit yet. The flashing cameras outside no longer looked like an adoring wall of support. They looked like the judgmental eyes of millions waiting to see if she would recover or crumble. And deep down she had to know that in this kind of war, it's not the next hearing that matters, it's how fast the tide of public opinion can turn against you.